Hello everyone and welcome to today's event on the substances of human origin regulation, also known as the SoHO regulation, currently being debated here at the European Parliament in Brussels. My name is Dave Keating, I'm a journalist based in Brussels, and I'm going to be guiding us through today's discussions. Now, last July, the European Commission adopted its proposal for this regulation, which will replace an existing 2002 blood directive and a 2004 tissues and cells directive. It combines them into one piece of law that will cover all donations of vital substances of human origin, including blood and tissues and cells, but also things like breast milk or microbiota. The Commission says the new law will make such donations safer and also facilitate cross-border circulation of these critical health products. They also say it will help encourage innovation in this field and will address concerns regarding the sufficiency of supply highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the proposal is now working its way through the legislative process, and it's being discussed here at the European Parliament in committees. It will have big implications for a sector which is quite significant in Europe. EU patients are treated with 25 million blood transfusions during surgery or trauma care, and over 36,000 stem cell transplantations for blood cancers are performed in the EU each year. Today we're going to talk specifically about how this new legislation will affect plasma-derived medicinal products in particular. Does the proposal represent a step forward or backwards for patient access to plasma-derived medicines? In our first panel, we're going to find out more about how this regulation will affect patient access to plasma. And we're very fortunate to be joined here by Giles Platford, chair of the Global Executive Board at the Plasma Protein Therapeutics Association, PPTA. And we also have Martine Pergent, president of the International Patent Organization for Primary Immunodeficiencies, IPOPI. Thank you both so much for joining us today. Giles, let's start with really the basics here. What is plasma, and why are plasma-derived medicinal products important?
Well, firstly, Dave, let me say how much of a pleasure it is to be here with you at this critical time when the EU is reviewing its substance of human origin legislation. Let me start with the basics. Plasma is the yellow straw-colored liquid that comprises about 50% of blood. It has critical functions like fighting disease and clotting blood. Now, therapies derived from plasma typically replace critical proteins that are deficient in patients who are suffering from complex, chronic, rare diseases. Diseases like primary and secondary immunodeficiencies, peripheral neuropathies, and blood clotting disorders. Now, in Europe alone, there are more than 300,000 patients who are suffering from sometimes life-threatening, certainly debilitating conditions who depend on plasma-derived therapies. And often these patients don't have alternative treatments available to them. And they're often lifelong patients. Now, to give you an idea, a primary immunodeficiency patient will require somewhere in the region of 120 donations per year to sustain their treatment. An alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency patient will require some 900 donations a year. Now, this is why the WHO considers plasma-derived therapies as essential on its essential medicines list. This is why such significant volumes of plasma are required to support these patients in need. Some 13 million liters of plasma alone need to be sourced each year for those 300,000 patients in Europe. And this is why we need to work together to ensure that we have legislation in place that actively encourages and promotes collaboration to support sustainable supply of plasma.
So let's talk about those patients. Martine, Giles was just mentioning the type of patients that plasma is really critical for. So tell us a bit about what is so crucial about plasma-derived medicines, specifically for primary immunodeficiency sufferers.
Indeed. So thank you, first of all, for giving patients their share of voice. PID patient, primary immunodeficiency patients, have their immune system that doesn't work properly or at all. So they need to have replacement therapy, and those medicines called immunoglobulins come out of plasma. So this is vital for them because there is no alternative treatment. They need this their lifelong on a regular basis, every week or every month. And if they lack this, they are really in a big trouble, and they may have very severe infection and even die. And we have people who died from lacking immunoglobulins. So if they are properly treated, then they can lead a normal life, meaning studying, working, having a family, socializing, and this is invaluable.
Giles, you cited just earlier this statistic, 120 donations per year needed for a patient. So obviously, a lot of donations are needed here for plasma, and both of your organizations have called on the EU and its member states to collect more plasma. Why is that so critically important?
Well, it's critical, Dave. We talked about the unmet patient need. That unmet patient need continues to increase every day, every year. Through increased diagnosis levels, improvements in standard of care, expanded access to these kind of treatments. And so even today, Europe has a deficit of about 40% in terms of the plasma that's needed to convert those leaders into treatments for its patients. 40% of the plasma used in Europe comes from the US. Another interesting statistic is that 44%, or close to half of all plasma needed to treat patients who depend on plasma-derived therapies in Europe, come from just 4 EU member states where the private sector is active, where there's active public-private sector collaboration to enable sourcing of plasma. This is why we need to ensure that Europe has in place legislation that actively encourages and promotes partnership and collaboration to enable sustainable supply of plasma.
I mean, it sounds very, very critical, and that 40% import from the US statistic is, it's limited, right? It's limited to very specific countries. And we know certainly for patients, right, patients who need this plasma so badly, this is something that would be a concern if you're worried about supply, right? From the patient perspective, how can this new legislation, the SoHO legislation, help the EU to collect more plasma, and what does that mean for the patients who really need it?
Yeah. From the patient perspective, it is very important to collect more plasma because at the moment, the real risk for them is the supply. Safety is not at stake because we rely on EMA and the national regulatory, and we are very confident on that, but safety is really supply. So this is the first thing. And I think that we have a very important momentum with the SoHO regulation to improve the way we collect plasma, to try new things, because this is for years that patients say, plasma is something, and this is not blood. They are really different, and we advocate for that, and we need that. We will need more and more plasma-derived medicinal products, and we need cooperation. We need plasmapheresis. We will speak of that later on, I guess, and I think this is really a momentum to achieve that.
Giles, one issue that's come up here in the European Parliament is making sure that patients have access to plasma-derived medicinal products, because even if you were importing a lot or maybe diversifying the number of countries that are producing here, it doesn't necessarily ensure that the patients are getting it exactly when they need it, right? So how can this legislation improve patient access and make sure that people are getting these things actually when they need them?
Well, thanks for the question, Dave. So firstly, very important that the EU is taking the opportunity to review the substance of human origin legislation. There are certain things in the draft legislation that as an industry we welcome. So we see recognition of the differentiation between whole blood donations for transfusion versus plasma for fractionation. We see recognition of the compatibility of compensation with the principles of voluntary unpaid donation. We also see recognition of the importance of some form of fixed rate compensation for donors. There are, however, areas of the legislation where we see opportunities for improvement to really enable sustainable sourcing of plasma. One such example is in the definition of compensation. Today, the legislation states that plasma donors should be compensated for losses. Now, given the frequency of donations, typically we're seeing between 20 to 60 donations in Europe for the average plasma donor, and the time taken to donate, it's roughly an hour when going through plasmapheresis, and this is different to whole blood donation, which is typically once a quarter for 15 minutes, we do believe that the legislative text should reflect that plasma donors should be compensated for the expenses and the inconveniences of donating. The other thing I would call out is that there needs to be recognition that plasma donation is safe. Now, the manufacturers of plasma go through numerous steps, whether it be screening of candidates for donation, but to ensure that they're healthy, the testing and sampling of every single donation to look for indicators of virus, the steps that are taken both chemical and physical in the manufacturing process to inactivate viruses, and then some self-imposed industry standards as well around systems, for example, that look at frequency and deferrals in donors. This results in a level of adverse events amongst donors that is literally 0.16%. That's very consistent with whole blood donation. And this proves that plasma donation is safe. Now, the current draft legislative text states that plasma donation infers significant risk. This is simply not correct. It's not true, and it's not grounded in science.
So, and we'll be talking more about these safety issues and the ethics issues in our two later panels. On the issue of compensation, so you mentioned that blood donation and plasma donation, two separate things. Is there a risk, as some have brought up here in the Parliament, concerns that compensation for plasma donations could crowd out blood donations? How would you respond to those concerns that have been raised here about that?
We do not believe that to be the case. And we believe that there is opportunity for private sector and public sector to coexist with plasma sourcing and whole blood donation. We have data points to support that. In Canada, we've seen actually an active private sector in plasma sourcing. Not only is it not detrimental to the volume of whole blood donations collected, it actually increases whole blood donations. And there are different ways of managing this. For example, here in Europe, in Hungary, plasma donors are required to donate whole blood at least once a year, and that's one mechanism to ensure that this balances out.
That's interesting. Martine, I mentioned at the beginning that COVID-19 was an experience, taught us a lot of lessons in lots of different ways, obviously, but one was about security of supply for medicines, and this was something that was of great concern during the pandemic. What was the impact of COVID-19 specifically on PID patients in terms of access to medicines and access to treatments? And what do you think are the lessons that we can learn from that, particularly as this new legislation is being crafted?
Mm-hmm. Well, as a consequence of the pandemic, we could see that patients didn't get their treatment as they used to have. For example, they didn't have the doses that they required, or they had to space out the treatment, or they had to stop the treatment even in some countries, and also the new diagnosed patient couldn't access treatment. That's all. So this is really vital. When it comes to the lessons, I would like to say that when it came to convalescent plasma for treating severe COVID patients, the world united, and we could see cooperation. The public and the private sector form alliance, proving the usefulness of the coexistence of the two sectors. And I think that also the EU provided money and also investment, and also support to its members to increase plasma collection. So this is possible, and we would like, why did it go so? It's just because it addressed the general population. And what we would like, when the general population is at risk, we are able to do that. Why wouldn't we do that for the rare disease field? Why would rare disease patients not be treated like the general population when it is shown possible? So I think there is something to do, and indeed to take lessons from this pandemic in the best sense for us.
Well, Giles, on that topic, Martine was talking about the cooperation between the public sector, private sector actors in this field. this is another concern that's been raised here in the Parliament, that you could get a situation where there's competition between public or NGO whole blood collection or plasma collection and private actors. And there are some here in the Parliament who are saying, no, we really need to crack down on this to make sure there isn't competition. Do you think there is a concern there in terms of competition? And how would you like to see the legislation build its framework around that?
Well, I do think there's a concern. I'm not sure it's justified, and I spoke to that in my last response. I think the EU legislation obviously needs to recognize that this is not a prescriptive legislation. Each independent EU member state should put in place a model that works for them. We've seen that done successfully. What we do want to see from the EU legislation is sufficient text that it is encouraging and promoting the putting in place of infrastructure that enables sustainable sourcing of plasma, that enables collaboration not just between public sector and private sector, but between multiple stakeholders in a way that makes sense for that country, so that we reduce the dependence that we have today in Europe on those 4 EU member states where that kind of collaboration is in place, on the US today, where 40% of the plasma for Europe comes from that country, so that we can have all EU member states contributing equally to sustainable source of plasma supply.
So we'll have this voted on eventually here at the Parliament in one of these rooms around us here. Martine, what would you say in talking to lawmakers? From the patient's perspective, what are the positive aspects of what's been proposed here by the Commission? And what would you like to see members of Parliament improve in the legislation?
Well, we are pretty happy with this proposition from the Commission, because indeed this is a step forward. And we can see, for example, the fact that the patient and the donor's safety is taken into consideration, meaning, as I said, that the safety for the patient is the supply at the definitions, as Giles Platford has highlighted, for plasma for fractionation versus plasma for infusion. And also, we think that information is mentioned. This is important to inform the general public about the fact that plasma collection exists, and give them the information so that they can decide if they want to be a donator. And last thing that we also acknowledge and welcome is that there is a need for crisis preparedness and also monitoring the supply. So to be prepared for the next crisis, because we know that they will happen. We don't know when, but they may happen. On the negative, well, it's not negative, but what we would like is more ambition. And ambition would consist first in promoting plasmapheresis, because we think this is the only way to have an increase, a substantial increase in plasma collection. The second thing is that we need also to look at those 4 countries who perform best in the EU, how they do, how they manage, so to be able to adapt in every country to the local specificities, but take lessons from that and adapt. I think this is really needed. Then I think also that we, as IPOPI, as the patient, we support very much the principles of altruism and solidarity between donors and recipients. But we think that every country should define the way it wants to compensate the donors, so it matches to the regional or local specificities and culture and possibilities. And this is something that is very important to us, because this is also a way to increase donation and to motivate people.
Giles, what about you? What is your key message to lawmakers as they prepare to make the votes on this legislation?
Well, Dave, I would say to the policymakers who are voting on this critical legislation, we need to have legislative text that encourages, promotes, and enables collaboration between public sector and private sector, but also more broadly between multiple stakeholders, to enable EU member states to come together and find a solution that works for them in their country, but contributes meaningfully, sustainably, and safely to ongoing supply of plasma.
Martine, kind of a similar question. As lawmakers are debating the issue, this is a very technical topic, right?
Oh.
And it's there can be misperceptions out there, certainly about both blood donation and plasma donation. What would you say is the biggest misperception about plasma donation among the public at large?
It's a tough question. I think that people are not aware of the good they do when donating plasma, because plasma is not so known, plasma collection donation is not so known, and I think that we really need to highlight this, and especially plasmapheresis, as I said, because all the donors I know would be keen on donating if they would know that this is about saving lives. But really, without the treatment, those patients will get infected and they will be very bad, and some of them lose their lives. This is fact-based. And as a lesson, I would say to the politician that we really want, that we would like a directive that is patient-focused. Technical issues, this is something that is manageable, but this is about lives, and this is what matters very much. And this is about facts, this is about science, this is about evidence, and we need to stick to that. And we really need to make a difference with this, because we can't go on with what we live for 20 years. Supply, tensions, supply, tensions, supply, tensions, and this is not a life for patients.
Giles, what would you say are the biggest misperceptions by the public? And do you think that some of those misperceptions are driving debate here in the Parliament?
Well, I think Martine said it beautifully. We need to get the narrative focused on the unmet patient need. Yeah. This is all about those 300,000 patients in Europe who depend on plasma-derived therapies. And these are patients with certainly debilitating, but often life-threatening conditions that don't have alternative treatments. And so all of this debate, all of this dialogue is about making sure that we have a sustainable supply of plasma that can be translated into medicines that will treat these patients and enable them to have quality of life and be able to have lifelong treatment that is transformative to their lives.
Yeah, so true.
Well, I think that definitely gives people a lot to think about as we go ahead to this vote. And Giles, you mentioned some of the safety concerns that have been brought up. That's actually going to be our next panel, where we're going to focus specifically on these safety issues, some of the conceptions that might be out there among the public, among lawmakers, and we'll dive into what the real issues are for safety in plasma and how that's going to affect that legislation. But for now, thank you both so much for joining me today. And if you guys will hold on, the viewers, we're going to take a short break to switch out the panelists, and then we'll come back here to talk about the safety aspects of the SoHO regulation. We'll see you back here in just a second.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome back. So as I mentioned in our second panel, we're going to be talking about some of those safety aspects that we heard a bit about from Giles before. This is an issue that has come up both with the Commission's proposal and as the legislation is being debated here in the European Parliament. We've heard concerns expressed about plasma, about whether it's really safe, whether the donation is safe, whether the receipt is safe. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about what those safety concerns are, what's kind of a real concern, what's perhaps misperceptions, and we'll also hear about how the legislation is going to address the safety concerns that are out there. So to talk about this, I'm joined here in the studio by Svenja Tatjana Barckhausen, who is the executive board member of the Blood and Plasma Donation Specialist Haema AG. And then we are joined remotely by Dr. Behrouz Mansouri, who is the medical director at the donation specialist PlasmaVita Magdeburg. Thank you both for joining us here today. Svenja, let's start with a question for you. This is something we talked a little bit about on the first panel, but what exactly is the difference between blood donation and plasma donation? Are the differences very significant? Because you guys are doing both. How different are the two types of donation?
Thank you for having me. And there are the obvious differences when we talk about the technical experts. The obvious is there's less quantity that you can donate. When you donate blood, it's about half a liter you can donate. For plasma, you can donate 850 milliliters. And there are such things like the frequency. Blood you can donate 4 to 6 times a year. And plasma in Germany, you can donate up to 60 times a year. I think that's pretty obvious, but what is not a big difference is actually the deferral criteria, or you might call them even acceptance criteria, because there we apply the same. So the donor base is the same, whereas we do have to say that not every blood donor would be a plasma donor. So there we have a differentiation. But for me, the bottom line is actually that the awareness is a big difference. Everyone knows blood donation. Plasma donation is really not that widely spread known. And if I point out something when there is a difference, I would say this is the key.
Yes, certainly in terms of public knowledge, more people are aware of blood donation than plasma donation. Could you just expand on why is not every blood donor is a plasma donor? Could you expand on why that is?
We could see that from our experience, and I think the donor base has a different approach. It takes not as long as a plasma donation, and blood has a different history. And the plasma donor is more a younger donor, is a donor that comes and has a different mindset. They probably know someone that has been ill, and they focus more on the finished product side, whereas the blood donor, as it is widely known where the blood is needed for in the hospitals, it's a totally different base, and that's why we can see that it's simply not the same donor base.
Well, Behrouz, let's turn to you remotely. You guys are specialized in plasma donation. So tell us why people should donate plasma, and why can we donate plasma, as Svenja was just saying, more often than we would donate blood? Like you were saying, 46 times a year for blood, 60 times for plasma. Why is that, Behrouz?
Good afternoon to everybody. Yes, first question, why should we donate plasma? We have heard a little bit about that just in the last talks of the different participants. Medicines from human blood plasma, so-called plasma-derived medicinal products, are essential for some 300,000 patients in the EU, and most of them are severely ill, and they rely on these medicines. Otherwise, they are in life-threatening conditions and substantially diminished quality of life, and perhaps they will not survive even. For treating single patients, we have heard there are several hundreds, up to 1,200 plasma donations necessary per year. And so I think plasma donation is quite a good thing to do, and therefore we ask for. And the second question was why can we differentiate, and what is the difference in frequency, and why? the established frequency limits of the different kinds of blood donation and component donations like plasma or whole blood or platelets, they are always based on human biology and physiology. So in case of whole blood donations, the regeneration of the red blood cells are the limiting factor. And that's why this kind of donation, whole blood donation, is limited to 8 to 12 weeks intervals, so about 4 to 6 times a year. In contrast, the regeneration of the constituents of plasma is much faster. Therefore, plasma donations up to twice weekly and up to 60 times per year are quite high, within a high safety margin for the donors, and without any harm for the donor to do so. So this is also confirmed by studies and by scientific approaches. This is the difference between the two frequencies. Yes.
So, Svenja, you mentioned that the public perception for blood donation is more common than plasma donation. And perhaps because of that, there has been a perception here at the Parliament in some of the debates that blood donation is safe, plasma donation, I don't know, maybe it's risky. Is whole blood donation safer than plasma donation?
Well, we don't see that the whole blood donation is safer than the plasma donation. I think they're pretty equal, safe. It is, with the blood donation, you donate cells. With the plasma, you donate the liquid part of your blood. And that's why we have the high frequency in Germany, because we do know that it is safe and it doesn't come out of the blue, the 60 donations that are allowed in Germany. And actually, we don't understand why it is called that it is a risky donation to do plasmapheresis. And the adverse events, we don't see a big difference. Honestly, for us, it is a stunning remark that it should be a high-risk donation.
Behrouz, similar question. So what we've heard is concerns about the patient safety, particularly the donor. So whether or not the donor's health might be affected by donating plasma. What measures are in place right now to ensure that donor health is protected sufficiently during the plasma donation process? And would that need to be enshrined in any way in legislation, the best practices there?
Yes, let me perhaps, because it is not so broadly known to people, to explain it a little more in detail, tell you about how it's going on if somebody goes to donate plasma. So every potential donor starts with a directed and sort of medical health check, ensuring that only healthy persons can donate at all. This health check is repeated at least every 15th donation and or every 2 years, and includes a laboratory check of important parameters like hemoglobin level or blood count or IgG or total protein level. Furthermore, the total protein and IgG levels, which are crucial, are measured every 5 donations even. And of course, every donor has, prior to every donation, fill a health check questionnaire prior to donation, and it is checked by a physician. So these specialized physicians are also mandatorily present throughout all the opening hours in our donation centers, and particularly are responsible for the care of the donor health and safety, of course also for the product's safety. And finally, we always adopt the frequency and volume of our donations or donors to the situation, the individual situation of each and every one of them. So taken together, it is a really very complete care for the whole process and the donors, which together with all the technical and safety approaches surrounding them, takes care of them, and it is a safe procedure. I can see any difference to whole blood donation, and I'm talking about 40 years of experience with both of them.
Svenja, we talked a bit about the compensation issue in the previous panel, which has been a very hot button issue here in the Parliament. There's kinds of two ways that people are talking about it. One is the ethical concerns, and we'll talk more about that in the panel after this one. But the other is the safety concerns that some people have suggested. If you're compensating people, then that could make the plasma itself unsafe. Are there safety concerns about this? Does compensating a plasma donor make their plasma lower quality, or are you attracting people that might have lower quality plasma? Is there anything to that?
Well, when you refer to quality of plasma, what does that mean? Is that the IgG level? I mean, I just want to put that on the table, that this word quality of plasma is widely used without saying what does it mean really. And the IgG level is something that I cannot influence by just getting 20 euros or 25 euros or you name it. And my body does not change with a bill in my hand or not having the bill. So if I go to donate in a non-compensated donation center or in a compensation donation center, it's still the same body. I think it refers to the motivation of the donors. And, but still then, even if it motivates me, that doesn't necessarily that I get accepted in a donation center. If I'm motivated by going to a center and donate just because of the money, there is still a medical doctor that would have a look at me. There is still a question that needs to be answered. So
in other words, there's nothing inherently different about someone's plasma who would be motivated by compensation. There's not anything that you would assume about that person's plasma versus anyone else's plasma, right?
Then motivation doesn't make a difference here. The plasma compensation doesn't make a difference here.
Behrouz, right now, we're seeing text in the regulation that indicates that plasma donation implies a significant risk. And that is something that the industry has pushed back on and has caused quite a lot of back and forth here in the Parliament. How risky or how safe is plasma donation? And do you think that this categorization of significant risk makes sense for plasma?
Well, I don't think so that this makes sense. I'm convinced, and it is based on data and science. I'm convinced that plasma donation does not imply a significant risk. What makes a plasma donation safe? It is based on a well-established procedure developed over decades with a tremendous implementation of safety margin and safety levels in the machines and the procedures itself. These comprehensive safety measures and sophisticated technology, together with all the experience over the decades, they are the source of safety for plasma donation, and all the studies available show that they are similar, plasma donors are similar safe like whole blood donors or other kinds of blood donors, component donors, let me say platelet donations. So studies have shown that also the so-called donor adverse events, which we categorize in different kinds, are extremely rare and as less as 16 in 10,000 donations. And this compares also very pretty well with the whole blood donations. Further donor vigilance data also show that both whole blood and plasmapheresis donations are comparably safe, and that medical interventions following these donor adverse events are, in both cases, extremely rare. Moreover, finally, the frequency of donations is not associated with safety risks. So if you can state that they come more often to donation with plasma, frequency goes hand in hand with safety, because the donor safety is assessed on every single donation. And this has also been shown by studies and by observational studies and prospective studies. So I'm altogether convinced that plasma donation is not a risk for the donors.
Svenja, we talked a little bit about motivation. So when you guys are looking at all your different centers, What would you say is the biggest motivation for people coming in giving donations? Does it differ for whole blood donors versus plasma donors? What's the most frequent motivation? Does it differ geographically? Does it differ? How have you observed that in the various centers?
Well, what I can say that when you talk to donors, the biggest motivation for a plasma donor is that they know someone who has a disease that is treated with immunoglobulins. So those, they have a very, very high motivation. And then, yes, the motivation is also to do something good in relation to being compensated. I think we do have to mention it, but it's not the first motivation factor. Otherwise, the donors would stand in line for donating, and apparently they're not doing it. It's still a lot of work to make donors aware and do marketing for donors. And with regard to blood donors and plasma donors, the blood donors, the motivation is, at least in Europe, it dates back to a long history of blood donation, and then we come back to the awareness question. And then yes, for plasma, the most important is when they see that we use very often the name being a hero in our marketing, that you do something good, that you can be proud of what you're doing. And this with having a fair compensation is a big motivation, apart from knowing someone who's been treated.
Yeah, it's interesting that so many of the plasma donors are doing so because they know someone who needs a plasma donation, perhaps because they didn't even know it was something they could do before they found out someone they knew needed it. Those people who come in because they know someone specific who needs it, do you find that those people come back afterwards? Do they keep donating once they know that they can and they know the process?
Yes, they keep donating. We do see the most valuable donors are anyway the repeat donors, because they're very aware what their product, their plasma is used for, that it is used for fractionation. And some of them, when you see events where we bring a patient and a donor together, and this is really breathtaking how they're touched by eventually meeting someone in person if they haven't personally known the patient. This is absolutely stunning when you see how touchy and sensitive this topic is to both of them.
Behrouz, as the lawmakers prepare to make votes on this legislation, what would be your key message to them based on your experience in donations, being really on the ground, knowing how this stuff works? What would be your key recommendation to them, and the thing you'd really want them to keep in mind when they cast their vote?
Let me say that my key message really in depth is that there is no evidence for classifying plasma donation as unsafe by the upcoming SoHO regulation. Regulation should consider that the data and the most recent technological, scientific, epidemiological, societal developments, they all ensure that the health of the donors are in our focus. We always looked after them, and we have no signs of having a dangerous procedure. There is no reason to classify plasma donation as unsafe altogether.
Svenja, what would be your key policy recommendation? And also, what's the thing that they could do in this legislation that would make your life easier, your work easier in getting these donations?
For me, one of the key messages is that you have to differentiate between blood and plasma, as it's not the same thing, it's not the same way of donation, that we do need a good definition on plasma for fractionation. That is, for me, a very, very big key message. And that compensation is not compromising plasma quality. Compensation is not related to plasma quality. That is very, very important.
Are there other aspects of the legislation, other than those issues, that you think might be escaping attention right now, but actually are quite important, that you'd like the lawmakers to focus in more on?
Well, if you ask that directly, I think it's very important about the compensation that it is for expenses and inconvenience, and not to be too specific on it. I think the countries, they will find their own way how to determine in a later stage how they want to rule that in the member states. but to have it on a same system that we are driving at the moment in Germany and all the other countries that are heavily performing plasmapheresis, I think we need the support in the regulation that we can go on with the system that we are currently having.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for talking about these safety issues. Certainly a lot to think about as we go forward in the legislative process. We talked a little bit about the ethical issues, so we've saved those for the last panel. We're going to take another short break before we bring in two new panelists to talk about these ethical issues that have been raised in the legislation, and particularly this compensation issue. So bear with us a moment, and we will be right back. Hello and welcome back to the third panel where we're going to be talking about the ethical implications of the SoHO regulation. This is a topic that has been brought up a lot here at the European Parliament as lawmakers have been going through the legislation. So in particular, there is this concern over compensation. The question of whether it's fair to donors, fair to society, or fair to the recipients to have donors compensated for their time, for their travel, and for their blood, for their plasma. And the key question here that lawmakers have been asking have to do with a couple different things. One is some have questioned whether it could be exploitational to be giving compensation to people who might be desperately in need of money and be giving blood or plasma in exchange for compensation. There have also been questions that I think we addressed in the previous panel about if someone is wanting compensation, could that have implications for the quality of their blood or plasma? And of course, the other side of that coin is that it is harder, of course, to get donations without compensation. And also, when people give blood or give plasma, they are taking a significant amount of time, particularly for plasma, and it may be hard for them to do so without receiving compensation. So lots of different opinions on this issue here at the Parliament. We are very fortunate to be joined by our two panelists here to talk about this issue. So we have here to my left Stelios Kympouropoulos, who is a centre-right member of the European Parliament from Greece, very involved in these discussions as an MEP. And we have Begoña Maestre, Professor of Ethics and Bioethics at the University of Barcelona. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us here today. Stelios, let me start with you. When we're thinking about the ethical implications of the legislation and some of the debates that have happened here, what do you think are the most important elements of the regulation that the Parliament should be rightly focused on?
First of all, thank you for this discussion. I think it's very timely, and the issues that we discuss here is the shortages. I think that it's a crucial issue when we have something which is missing. We need to find the right balance in order to have a regulation, in particular SoHO regulation, that it's so vital to have these substances of human orientation, and we need to have a safety and to have quality standards. And we need to I think that we need to find the right balance between member states and what is missing in order to bring as much as possible donors in giving their time, their effort, and their cells for those that are need. So, in my opinion, it's not so much the compensation. It's something that, yes, that is discussed, but I think that we need to find the solutions to create the treatments that are needed in EU, not to borrow plasma from other countries.
Begoña, it's great to have you here to get an academic perspective on this. Now, when we're talking about compensation, there's lots of different ways that we'll dive into here. But there is, of course, there's compensation, and then there's incentivization, right? Can you explain what is the difference between compensating and incentivizing?
Yeah, both incentivizing and compensating aim to increase the supply of plasma. The goal may be the same, but not the meaning and the message. To compensate means to give something or to make a benefit to someone in compensating for the damage that has been caused. Compensation is not an euphemism for payment. Compensation is a gesture of gratitude for expenses and inconvenience, time, travels, etc. It's also a gesture of recognition of the donor's altruism toward the community. In the case of incentivizing, the donor's only or main motive is reward. there would be no donation without this incentive, because it determines the willingness to donate. Specifically, compensating a donor effort with monetary or non-monetary measure is not an incentive that determines the willingness to donate. Of course, in real life, it's difficult to tell the difference. It's hard to evaluate the internal will and altruistic motivation of the donor, and to what extent compensation acts as the only motivation. But theoretically, two differences can be made. One, in the amount of the compensation, the amount of remuneration, the principle of proportionality must be guaranteed. The compensation does not exceed the donor's effort, expenses and inconvenience. Neutral financial compensation is intended to make a difference versus incentivizing. But second, in public awareness campaigns that encourage giving plasma, the information provided about the amount of compensation should be left until the end. The information about compensation must be, but it must be not the focus of attention, because compensation must not be the main reasons for donating. This order in the informing process is important. Patient needs and sense of community first. Society's recognition for the donor's effort second. This point be crucial for European Union regulations. In brief, the idea is to say that the exception proves the rule. The exception is the compensation. The rule, altruism and solidarity. In gratitude for this action, the community recognizes the donor for their time and effort, while at the same time compensating them to some extent for their trouble.
It's interesting what you say about informing at the end of the process can make sure that the person isn't doing it solely or mostly for some type of reward, but that it is just simply a compensation for their time. Stelios, given these ethical concerns about the compensation issue, what do you think of the text as it stands right now, and what do you think needs to be adjusted or improved based on what the Commission has put forward?
So, first of all, I think that we need a greater involvement on consultation of patients' organization, but also the health professionals. We need from their side to give their input. Secondly, I think that we need to create to have the right balance between private and public sector to get involved, both of them, in order to have better results. In different member states, we have seen that whenever there is this kind of collaboration, the results are better. We need to have on this process also to strengthen the workload of the work of the involvement, of EMA, European Medicine Agency. We need to have a greater coherence within with the other EU-related agencies to health, and to create a connection between the data. So I think this is a very important and timely period where we have the ongoing process of regulating HDS, so we can create a connection between the two regulations. I think that this regulation create an effort to ensure that voluntary and unpaid donation is disqualifying the safety of donations made by donors. So I think that we need to show that it's not depending the compensation if it's safe or not safe, the final product, because if we have remunerated or non-remunerated donors, the final product are equal. So this is something that it need to be sufficiently clear to all the stakeholders and all the parts and actors of this process. And I think that we need to give, as dear Professor said before, to give more incentives in order to be independent from third countries. But I repeat myself that it is not connected if the process is compensated or not, because we have the same final product with the same safety and the same quality in both ways.
I mean, Begoña, you were talking a bit before about the differences between compensation and incentives, and as you mentioned, Stelios, that there has to be something there. How can that vary? Because of course, you could have a direct cash payment, but there's other ways you could compensate someone. You could compensate someone with tax breaks. You could compensate someone with giving them a paid day off work. Do you think are the ethical concerns, or just the ethics in general, are they the same for all the various types of compensation? Is there some compensation that has less concern, you think, than others?
Yeah. Ethically, it is equally acceptable to compensate in kind, because the essence of the compensation is the same. One working day holiday, it's equal, one salary day in euros. Here we have a real euphemism. In the end, another kind of compensation can be translated into the money. Money is the simplest way, and donors can't decide about what to do with it. The donation is accessible to anyone and at their own discretion. Monetary compensation allows the donor herself to decide how to better use or allocate the compensation received. However, financial compensation can be fairer because it is the same for everyone. Many variations can occur with tax breaks or a paid day of work. Compensation can be better depending on incomes, or can allow too many days of holidays. We must not forget that many young people who do not work, students for instance, will not be compensated with tax breaks or day off work. This group is the main target to call to become a donor. I insist, a single way of compensation is better, and monetary compensation is the simplest.
So in other words, monetary compensation is an equalizer, because if you start getting into specifics, okay, we'll only compensate people with a day off work, or we'll only compensate people with tax breaks. A day off work isn't helpful to someone who isn't working. Tax breaks may not be interesting to particularly low-income people. It's interesting. I mean, in other words, trust the donor to have that compensation work in the way that fits best for them, right?
Yeah.
Stelios, I guess it's interesting when people are talking about the ethics of the compensation. There is, of course, the other side of the coin, which is whether too stringent rules around compensation could actually mean that not enough people are donating and that people may be suffering or could even die because there isn't enough plasma donation happening. Do you think that conversation is being had in the parliament as well, the ethics around increasing plasma donation to save lives?
I think that this is the most important issue, to create the framework in order to support people of getting involved in the process of collecting plasma. Definitely, there is a strong argument for not commercializing the human body and the substances. But on the other hand, there is also the figures that show that in countries like the US, where the donors receives a higher compensation, there are more donations and higher supplies. So I think that we need to first of all, to protect patients and their access to their therapy. And bearing in mind that since a very substantial proportion of the total amount of plasma medicinal products used in Europe originated from remunerated donors. We're coming from other countries. So what do we want? This is the only question that we need to answer. We want products because the process of the final product of this process is to cure and to protect some people. And on the other side, these products are coming from countries where some people have taken some compensation. So we need not to be hide behind our figures, and we need to give real answers on this ongoing process. And we need to be true with ourselves and create the protection for the people and to create to make higher the donating process. So I think that it's no matter of ethical dimension. There is an answer, and the ethical answer is that we need to invest on creating these plasma-derived products on European level.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, that it would be hypocritical for the EU to ban compensation and then import plasma from countries that are compensating the donors. Now, Begoña, you mentioned that obviously you don't want the compensation to be the primary motivation for somebody donating. One of the amendments that's been introduced here in the Parliament to try to get around this situation and try to discourage that type of motivation has been this amendment that would, it would make people only be able to be compensated for quantifiable losses rather than for expenses and inconveniences, as was the case with the previous legislation. What would be the difference between those things in practice if that wording were to actually be changed in this text?
In my opinion, the notion of quantifiable losses is too polysemic and even ambiguous. By losses, one might understand the biological material donated by the donor, which is absolutely wrong. And quantifiable means something too objective, and at the same time very difficult to be quantifiable. For instance, one person can go to the donor center on foot, and other people can go by metro. Both of them are giving their time and their commitment, but the cost is not the same. The notion of expenses and inconveniences focuses more on the experience of the donor, which is variable and hard to quantify, to be quantified. Compensation attempts to minimize the expenses, easier to quantify, but inconveniences too. Finally, losses sound too negative. Something is lost. In contrast, the notion of expenses and inconveniences recognizes the effort involved in an ethical action such as donation. But in the end, society and patients win. And they want to appreciate the commitment of the donor, something different to paying the real cost. A system of reasonable and proportional monetary compensation for a donor's expenses and inconveniences related to donation, time, frequency, travel, effort, is desirable. But I insist that it can be understood as a gesture of courtesy for the donors, commitment with her fellow citizen. I prefer inconvenience.
Is it the quantifiable part that's more problematic or the losses part? In other words, could you have quantifiable expenses and inconveniences, or is the requirement to quantify it just not really possible?
It's difficult to quantify this subject and this aspect. Yeah. And I don't like losses. Yeah. Because it's too negative. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess somebody considering plasma donation, they see losses that all of a sudden sounds like they're doing something.
Something
that they lose something.
Yeah.
Stelios, so you're going to be one of the policymakers here making decisions on this. What is your message to citizens, to patients who need this type of life-saving material? What's your message to them in terms of how this House is going to handle this legislation, which does have a direct impact on people's lives all over the EU?
First of all, I think that we are a very good time of period because we have understood as policymakers that it's time to create this European Health Union, and so many different regulations are coming, and on this process we need to create connections between regulations. But particularly for this regulation, we try to create the path for greater access to medicines. We need more supplies in the EU, and we aim to raise awareness of the importance of donations. Health literacy is also important, and I'm very optimistic because we have and we can create the necessary legislative tools to increase the incentives for donations, but ensure safety standards for both the patients and the donors. So I think that the most valuable issue right now is that we are here, we hear the needs of people, and we try to create the right framework in order to fulfill all the needs these needs that are here many times before, many years before, but we didn't have the first. We didn't do the first step, and I think because I'm quite optimistic as person that we have the COVID-19 pandemic to understand that it's time to act as a union.
Just to follow up, what would you say to a citizen or a patient who says, hey, we have these two pieces of legislation already on blood and on plasma. Why do we need to combine them into this new thing?
No, it's not a combination, sorry. Because we create a greater, a larger piece of legislation. Because in this new SoHO regulation, it's not all plasma, it's not only blood, but also tissues, cells. Let's say we can, in this new legislation, all the breast milk is included, or a very new and very promised for the whole health professions part of body, microbiota. So, I mean, with microbiota, we are talking about the microbes where are plant on our skin or in our intestine. It's a valuable, and we can have a very good solutions for some very innovative therapies. So SoHO is something better than the combination of blood or plasma.
Begoña, do you agree that it's better to combine these things all into one comprehensive piece of legislation than having them, as is the case now, separated into different pieces of legislation?
Yeah, I think so. Because for example, a specific interpretation is accepted in compensating donations in eggs and sperm. Why do we advocate a different criterion with plasma, which is vital for many patients? Being parents is not vital. Applied ethics deals with these problems. The opposing parties have good reasons to defend their thesis. But yeah, compensating an activity doesn't change its meaning. Europe prohibits compensating, but buys what it needs from abroad. Sperm and eggs donation are remunerated extremely well in Spain. And neither of these practices is subject of criticism and of rejection. They are a big contradiction and can be understood as a legal paradox and as a moral hypocrisy too. I propose different treatment for different subjects because the problem is different and the solution must be different too.
So what would be your key message to the lawmakers here in the Parliament who are going to be debating this and voting on it in the coming months? What would you like them to keep in mind at the foremost, at the front of their brains?
Yeah. So compensation from plasma donation can be justified ethically when with the pure altruistic plasma donation model is not sufficient to meet the therapeutic needs of patients. It must not prevail if this means the patient do not receive medicine. The balance between risk and benefits, principles of non-maleficence and beneficence, make proportional compensation appropriate. The donor is informed and her autonomy respected. Justice is also contemplated as it can be understood from two dimensions. On the one side, compensation can supply the plasma for derived medicine and allow wider accessibility to patients. Nevertheless, on the other hand, at the biggest disadvantages, of the compensation is that the poorest people will be the most attractive ones. The principle of proportionality, financial neutral allowances, and the control of frequency and the number of times of donation should relieve this weakness. The fact is that it is insufficient altruism in society to meet demand. This reality means that we must address and resolve without ambiguity and evasion the question of it is fair to reject treatment with plasma products to safeguard the principle of pure altruistic donation. It is the role of the public authorities to promote cooperation and solidarity. However, if such efforts are unsuccessful, we cannot close our eyes to reality of therapeutic demands that the authorities must also strive to satisfy. Proportional, neutral, and legally regularized compensation could achieve this, as has been shown in other countries.
Thanks a lot. I mean, certainly a lot to think about as we go forward and as this legislation works its way through here. Thank you to both of our panelists for the conversation about ethics. I mean, we're just about out of time, but I think today we've heard both why this legislation is here in the first place, why plasma and whole blood donation are two separate things that need to be kind of legally recognized as two different things, even as they are now in the same comprehensive piece of legislation. We've also talked about the safety aspects that have been brought up here in the Parliament and also the ethical aspects, particularly this issue of compensation. These debates will continue here in the Parliament in the coming months as this legislation works its way through. Of course, not just the Parliament, but also with national governments and the Council. And in the end, hopefully we end up with the best version of the legislation that we can have, especially considering that it is replacing some previous legislation that has been on the books for quite a number of years. So thank you to both of you. Thank you to all the panelists which joined us here today. I hope you all found it interesting at home. I wish you all a wonderful evening.